this will end only when Trump says it ends. And I think it will leave Netanyahu with no real achievement.
There are these 2,500 US Marines on the way to Kharg Island in the Persian Gulf. How would that change this conflict?
One bad decision has been doubled down on every stage so far, right? Doing the operation was a mistake. Escalating the operation was a mistake. Potentially doing the cargo operation was a mistake. I don't understand how we can just continue to make the same decision over and over and think the outcome will be different.
Welcome to this latest edition of the Fourcast, coming to you from the bunker of my hotel. In fact, the corridor to the hotel kitchen. This is the safest place in the hotel. And we've spent so much time here in the last few days because the number of sirens and alarms over Jerusalem has increased exponentially, that instead of interrupting the pod as we had to do yesterday, we've decided to do it all from here for you today. And of course, there's no shortage of news. There are reports today that Donald Trump has dispatched more than 2,000 US Marines, perhaps to try and capture Kharg Island. That is the all-important Iranian oil terminal in the Persian Gulf. Is he doing that? Is that his plan? How will that change the war? Then, of course, last night, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Iran can no longer enrich uranium. Is that true? How do they know? Where is the uranium, by the way? And what difference will that make to the war? So to get a sense of the state of this conflict, almost 3 weeks in, we're joined now by Nate Swanson, as an American State Department veteran on the subject of Iran. He worked for the Biden administration. He also worked for the Trump administration until he was fired last year. And we'll find out from him why, because he's the kind of guy you really want on your team, especially at the moment. And then we have Ronen Bergman, who is an Israeli investigative journalist based in Tel Aviv. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Nate. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. I guess, the latest development is that there are these 2,500 US Marines on the way to Kharg Island in the Persian Gulf. We're not quite sure what Trump intends to do with them, but there's a suggestion that he intends to take it. Is that the way you read it? And how would that change this conflict?
That is how I read it. And I think the perception that the Trump administration using here is that they can exert this kind of maximum pressure, and then it's going to cause Iranian capitulation. And it's kind of the same thinking that's led us to where we are right now, which is that I think from the Trump administration perspective, and I don't think this is shared by the Israelis, but from Trump's perspective, they still think force leads to capitulation. And as long as we continue to put more force on, at some point Iran will capitulate. And it just hasn't happened yet. We've seen the exact opposite. And I don't know for sure what will happen with the cargo operation, but my guess would be we have more of the same. Iran will retaliate in kind, and then what?
I mean, we kind of say, or have said rather flippantly, that war is a way of teaching Americans, including their president, geography. But it turns out that Trump has been obsessed or interested in Kharg Island since 1988, when he made a statement about taking Kharg Island if he was in charge. So this is a bit of a theme for him.
Yeah, apparently. I mean, I guess I can't really explain why he feels that way, but he's talked about it a lot, and this has been a key theme. And as we saw kind of in Venezuela, he sees kind of the spoils of victory to include oil. How that works here, I don't know, and how Iran responds, whether they self-sabotage or they go after Gulf energy, I don't really know. But I think both are viable possibilities. So. Yeah, I don't know why the president is obsessed with this, but clearly is. I mean, I would just say, though, this is not a new option. And this has kind of always hypothetically been a military option for the U.S. I just never considered in this context or that seriously.
Ronen Bergman in Tel Aviv. I mean, last night the Prime Minister here, Benjamin Netanyahu, gave a press conference in Hebrew and in English, as he often does. And one of the things he stated was that Iran can no longer enrich uranium. Now, what exactly did he mean by that? Where is the uranium? There's famous 440 kilograms, as far as we know. And do you think he was telling the truth?
So I think that he meant exactly what literally was understood. And I would be flashing out the differences in what he said in Hebrew and in English, because it was not the same, though on the same panel just 2 minutes after. Where in Israel he said, we will fight as long as necessary, basically giving the impression as if we are looking at a war that will take quite long time to exhaust. In English, he said, this is going to take far shorter. It's going to end much sooner than everybody thinks, which is not exactly the same. Now, in Hebrew, he didn't say anything about no enrichment, while in English he said, and he said no capability to produce new missiles. I just want us to recall that at the end of the war in June, after President Trump gave his famous speech about obliterated, Prime Minister Netanyahu said, we removed the existential threat of the nuclear existential threat and the missile existential threat for generations to come. And guess what? Generations to come means maximum 8 months. So he was lying then as he was lying last night. He knows that this is not true. Of course, the industrial level of 22 or at least 20,000 centrifuges that were operating in those two sites, Natanz and Fordo, this is gone. This was bombed, this was damaged, but the Iranians still, not all the centrifuges were damaged. They put some of them in safe. And more important, since 2021, they kicked out the IAEA inspectors from the two factories, Tessa and Teba, where they produce new centrifuges. So this is unregistered. They have hundreds, possibly thousands, but they don't need more than few hundreds and something around the size of a baseball court to put together. They have the machinery, they have the knowledge, maybe they can even do that secretly, and have a very rapid, and I was told relatively simple process to enrich the 60% to 90%. So this is not true. They can enrich the uranium, and the uranium, the 430, sufficient quantity for something like 11 bombs if enriched to 90%. This is the most, I would say, critical component that if removed, it will seriously, not as a proposing statement, but this will seriously decapitate the Iranian nuclear project for a very long time because they need to start from the beginning. But if not, they are close to or they have the ability to assemble a first device, nuclear device, and test that. And that depends on a political decision, and that depends on their ability to hide it, but it does not depend on their knowledge and capability.
So just to sum up what you've said, despite all the depletion of their military assets, the 16,000 airstrikes from the Israelis and the Americans, you're saying that they still might have this ability to enrich uranium to 90%, where it could, in theory, be used to be strapped, to the front of a missile, should they still have that technology available somewhere.
I said just one correction. I said a device. I didn't say a warhead. A warhead technology to miniaturize a device, the shoulders of a ballistic missile, that will take another year or a year and a half, the expert says. But just imagine, a horrible imagination there. If Iran runs a test, an underground nuclear test, this will change the course of history in the Middle East. Even if they don't have a warhead, enough that they have a test, and the repercussions are going to be severe. And I think, I think it's not enough to bury the material. It's not enough to bomb the material. It's not bombable. Like it's very hard to kill from a distance. But the whole world is waiting for a commando raid on the site where they hide that. And I assume that the Iranians also read the press and are also waiting for these commandos to come.
Nate, I mean, it's fascinating what Ronen said there about Benjamin Netanyahu's message in Hebrew and English being somewhat different. And it sounds like the English version of his message last night was really meant to kind of reassure the American public, this thing will be over quite soon, but also reassure Donald Trump. Is there any sign that Trump and Netanyahu, who are in lockstep on this since the beginning, are beginning to fall out?
Have they been in lockstep since the beginning? I don't know. I mean, I think from the U.S. perspective, and the Israeli perspective, are quite different on this. I mean, I think from Trump's perspective, this was going to be June 2025 all over again. It was going to be quick, it was going to be decisive, and it was going to be a major victory. And he has this long history of defying critics. And I think, you go all the way back to moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I was in the State Department this time. There was this perception like this was the end of the world. Nothing happened. And then, same thing, midnight hammer strike last year. This was going to lead to immediate breakout of Iranian nuclear weapons. Nothing happened. Maduro operation, nothing happened. So I think from Trump's perspective, and this is just my, tangential communications with folks still in the admin, was that there was this, they were like, Trump's going to do this. It's been successful in the past. Why is it going to be successful? Why won't it be successful this time? So I think that's from the American perspective. And then now we're kind of flailing to figure out what the objective is. And then Ronen should correct me, but my perception from an American perspective is that from the Israeli perception is that this is, really, the post-October 7th mind frame, that you're no longer going to accept these threats, the rhetoric that came out of Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, it was no longer acceptable. And so these are two very different objectives. And so they might have had, military objectives that overlap for a day, a week, 2 weeks, but the angle is very different. So, and I think tactically where we've seen when Israel has hit Iranian energy infrastructure, this has made Trump extremely uncomfortable because this has a huge global impact on the global economy. So I do think ultimately the objectives are not the same, but very much welcome Ronen, disagreeing with me on this.
Well, I think that in order for me to disagree, I would need to know what were the objectives of both sides from the beginning. And I'm not sure that anyone really knows, because the Israelis basically waits for or rush the process of hitting more targets, because they understand that the fate of the war is dictated from somewhere else, not in Israel. It's not even the prime minister with their complicated relations. It's about Trump. They, I think, relieve the intelligence and the military chiefs relieve themselves from the need to think about the day after, because it says it's not up to us anyway. It's about Trump. And the New York Times team, we also heard some of the explanations coming from American officials about some different objectives. But I would then ask, what were the American objectives? I think that the Israeli objectives were to use the historical opportunity of having such a massive military buildup in the Gulf, the American, and the ability of, a complicated mixture of circumstances and people trying to convince Trump, including Netanyahu, but also because of the process, using the opportunity and hit Iran as hard as possible with some, sharing of targets and the burden between them and the U.S. And this is basically how Israel sees this. What were the Americans trying to think, if Khamenei is killed, then they will have a Maduro-style government? Who said that? Who promised that?
But it's so interesting, because from my impression, talking to Israeli, government officials, I spoke to President Herzog yesterday, speaking to Israelis, there seems to be, as you say, Ronen, a kind of broad understanding of why they're doing this. And we know that it's been an obsession with Netanyahu forever. But Donald Trump has changed his tune almost as often as he has changed his kind of happy meals in the last few weeks. And I wonder whether that's just him being inarticulate and a bit woolly, or whether there is genuine confusion there, Nate. And given that question, how serious do you think he now is about putting boots on the ground, which is something he always said he wouldn't do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I genuinely don't think he knows what his objective is beyond American glory on the front end, right? And we've seen it switch so many times. The first day it was regime change, but by the second day, it was military degradation, then complete surrender. He wanted to pick Khamenei's replacements. It's changed every day. But now I think the objective has shifted to Iran capitulating into opening the strait, which was, open 3 weeks ago. And so I don't know how you go from here. But on one hand, I kind of thought, and incorrectly, that at some point Trump would just pull the plug on this and say, okay, this is too much of a threat to my own domestic politics, too much of a threat to the global economy. I have to, we're done. And he could say, look, I killed Khamenei, I degraded the military, all successes. But he seems to instead be going the opposite way, doubling down, which I think is still based on this idea that that Iran will capitulate and he'll get like a Delcy Rodriguez equivalent. And so I don't even know who that is at this point. I mean, they're almost all dead. I'm running out of Iranians that I feel like I kind of understand at this point. So, I don't think, Jalili is going to be sitting down and talking to Trump anytime soon if that's who they think the successor is. So I don't know. So I do think it's quite likely we do Kharg, but then what? I mean, I don't know because I don't see Iran capitulating.
And Nate, we should just at this point remind the audience that you were fired by the Trump administration because you knew too much about Iran, not because you knew too little, because you were one of the experts who were warning about the very kinds of things that we're now seeing unfold. And one of Trump's biggest, influencers and friends, Laura Loomer, who's a far-right ideologue, basically had you fired. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's some nuance there. Look, I mean, so I got Loomer. I mean, so I'll say in the administration's defense, right? I mean, I had senior political officials reach out to me and ask me to help be a part of the negotiations team last spring. And so, I mean, I think, that was a genuine good faith effort, and then I just became and those same people treated me very well the entire time I was there. And, like these are, Trump officials, good. But, Loomer just has a lot of personality and it just wasn't worth it at some level for the government, to keep me. So, that's just the atmosphere we created. But I don't, that's the responsibility of Donald Trump. That's the responsibility of Marco Rubio, but it is not all Trump officials. And I don't think it had anything to do with my knowledge. It just was, I was like, I was in the Biden NSC and that, just was something to go after. So anyway, that doesn't really matter that much. And I'm not convinced that I would be listened to either way. So, whatever.
Ronen, I mean, in trying to decipher what the motivations for this war really were, which I think is essential because that might give you some hint about what level of pain the Trump administration, but also the Netanyahu administration is prepared to put up with. What was your reading of the events, that led up to the 28th of February? Was it Netanyahu leading Trump by the nose? Was it that Trump always wanted to do this and actually bounced Netanyahu into it? Because I was told that actually he wants to go in June and not as early as the end of February. What's your understanding for the timing and the rationale behind the beginning of this war?
The bottom line is that for the third time in 8 months, Netanyahu was able or got Trump in the exact point where he wanted Trump to be. First, surprising everybody, Trump gave his blessing to an Israeli attack on the night between the 12th and the 13th of June. Last year. Second, to the great surprise of everybody, Trump joined in, sent the B-1. And third is Trump fulfilling Netanyahu's, I think, biggest political and diplomatic and international dream of having a joint, full cooperation, full partnership strike over Iran. Netanyahu told me in 2019, when we did the cover story for the New York Times Magazine about the confrontation between Obama and Netanyahu about striking Iran, he said, and the Obama administration was suspecting Netanyahu that he is trying to drag the U.S. into war. He said, of course, I was not trying to drag them, but if I can get the U.S. participate in attacking Iran, of course I would rather do it with American participation. And what happened here, I think, is a mixture of smart Netanyahu and some other advisors whispering to Trump's ear that he is the one. Unlike other American presidents, especially, I think that was told this trigger, unlike Obama, he is the one with the courage. He is the one with the kahunas. He will do what they were afraid to do. This is one thing. And the other, so Netanyahu comes to see Trump in Mar-a-Lago at the end of the year, the end of 25. And he present to him a plan, two plans, either strike together or Israeli unilateral strike with the U.S. helping in the defense between April and June. Trump doesn't closed the door. He said, maybe, but you come again and we discuss it again. So basically, Netanyahu just gives the order to get ready. And then the protest starts. And the protest basically changes everything. With Trump, I believe, this is just my assessment, sort of like a little bit of trapping himself into that, being very much smugged after Maduro and thinking that is an omnipotent. And I think that a lot of people, not just Trump, a lot of people start, especially in Israel, after he concluded the war and brought back the hostages. The Israel, if he runs in Israel tomorrow, he would beat any candidate, even in Jerusalem, even where you are now, even in the shelter where you are. So, I think that he started to believe, people started to believe, and one thing led to another. He started speaking about the aid is on its way, help is on its way. But then on the 15th of January, he completely flips the targets and started to speak about nuclear. How is this helping? If you have a deal with the regime about nuclear or missile, then of course what you're going to give the regime in return is immunity to the regime if they give you what you want on this. So this is the opposite of helping the protesters. And you have these things happening again and again. But I think that the bottom line is that there would not be an American strike, American war with Iran if it wasn't for the protest, and it wouldn't be a war with Iran if it wasn't for Netanyahu. The exact measurement, the balance, I'm not sure I can do that.
Right. So last June, I was here as well for the 12-day war, mercifully short at the time. And what I was led to believe by Israeli officials afterwards is that actually for Israel, Trump ended that war too soon. They wanted to carry on and do more. And so there was an agreement afterwards that at some stage they would have to revisit this and try again. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Because Netanyahu and Trump created such a gap between reality and what they say reality was, then everybody expected this to be long-lasting generations, and suddenly they come on a circle to the same position.
So what's the nightmare scenario for Israel here? Is it that Trump suddenly gets fed up with gas prices going too high, he's worried about the midterm elections, and he's bored, he wants to move on to Cuba or play golf, God knows what, and he says, I declare victory, the big guy's dead, all these other guys are dead, all their missiles are dead, I'm going to go home now. And then that leaves Israel to kind of deal with this on its own. Is that a nightmare scenario, or is that something that Netanyahu is almost expecting to happen?
So I think that the military, the expert, the intelligence officials, they understand. Basically, they ran out of serious targets. They can continue bombing Iran for months, for years. But the level we're talking about now, like third-tier targets, not very important. It exhausted itself. And I think that there are many military officials who are just waiting for Trump to push the button and stop. On the Netanyahu front, it's different. And I think this, in a way, correlates with Trump. Both leaders, I believe, and at least Netanyahu, cannot say this time, we remove the threat. And you already see in Netanyahu's speeches that because he understands that he cannot say, I remove the existential threat, he's now writing again, re-engineering the targets of the war. So he's no longer speaking about the nuclear, unless in English for the foreign reporters last night, but he's no longer speaking in Hebrew about the nuclear threat, the existential threat, something that he built a career on. Suddenly he says, it's enough for us to be a regional superpower to confront all threats for generations to come. This is a sign that Netanyahu sees the end of the war very soon.
So from what you're saying, you think this might actually, from Israel's point of view, be over quite soon. And what about regime change? What about, the rump regime that's left in its bunker that has shown an extraordinary resilience that certainly that Nate might have predicted, but no one in the Trump administration was predicting?
It will end only when Trump says it ends. Netanyahu will obey, as he did last time, even being furious, even having to turn back the planes. This will end only when Trump says it ends. And I think it will leave Netanyahu with no real achievement. And I just...
So we could be back here again in a year's time.
Well, in a year's time would be after the elections, and maybe he's not the prime minister.
Can I ask a question, Ronen, though? This is the fundamental thing. So, this is a really unpopular war in the U.S., right? And I am guessing, don't know for sure, that the president will not be open to another round of this again. He wants to say we have permanently degraded Iran's military. Iran is going to reconstitute their missile and UAV program. So, like, where does that leave Israel? Because, Israel will want to strike again in 6 months, but there's a pretty decent chance that Trump won't, especially on the trajectory we're going. So what is that? What happens then?
Then they will, if it's Netanyahu and another politician, will find all the excuses why suddenly the existential immediate threat became not very existential and not very immediate. And because you always make concessions and make comparisons. But I think that the Israeli public is not aware of the fact that, for example, the military is counting launchers, missile launchers. And they say there were 450 at the beginning, and now we destroyed 300, 350. But it could be true. I think that it's a little bit exaggerated, but it could be true. Let's say it's true. What they don't explain is that it's very hard to produce a ballistic missile. It's not very hard to produce a launcher. It's just a truck with a little bit of work. It will take the Iranians no time, and this bottleneck will be open, and then they can fire the rest of the 3,000 that they still have. So I think that there's a propaganda machine that is being laundering all the time and creating achievements. And every time, again and again, the Israeli public are disappointed. They are taught to believe that force can solve everything. Then they realize it's not. And at the end of the day, you cannot win. At the end of the day, you cannot win this. There's not ultimate victory unless you have an agreement.
Okay. Ronen, that's a really interesting note for you to end on, because I know you've got to rush off, but I want to carry on with Nate. And I want to pick up, is American leadership, or perhaps even Israeli leadership, just not as smart as the smart bombs that they fire against Iranian targets? Because the smart thing at the end of the day has to be a political solution, and they're obsessed with military solutions.
Clearly they're very smart people, and the president is smart. I mean, he is. I just think they just aren't paying attention to Iran. Like, they're not thinking that Iran has a vote in this calculation at all. I mean, we clearly have military superiority. We clearly have military dominance, but that doesn't translate into capitulation. And so that part just seems to be missing from the equation. And I just think it's driven by this extreme confidence that a bombing campaign can lead to regime change, or, picking the supreme leader or whatever. And that just fundamentally is just kind of ignoring some very basic facts about Iran. And so, I don't know if it's not, I don't know. I don't know what that, I mean, it's not a lack of intelligence. It's just an overconfidence in your own ability, I think.
But maybe a lack of, judgment or wisdom. I mean, it strikes me that about 3 weeks into this war, almost 3 weeks, the rather resilient Iranian rump regime is holding the world economy in a choke through the Straits of Hormuz, and has also confronted the Trump administration with the choice. You can either choose to save the world economy, so you call it a ceasefire, you do a deal, and even that's beset with doubt, or you protect Israel. And that is a choice I don't think that Donald Trump ever wants to face, but he's facing it.
Totally. I mean, I completely agree. I mean, and like Iran, I mean, obviously can't compete like conventionally with us, but asymmetrically they're forcing this choice. And I'm not in the military, I'm not in the government anymore, so I don't have great insights into what exactly Iranian capabilities are. But right now, when they seem to want to do something and they announce they're going to do something, they seem to do it successfully. And so my assumption here is that Iran can keep inflicting pain on the U.S. and pain on the global economy for a while. It seemed to want this war of attrition. So, yeah, the longer this goes on, I feel like the more it plays into Iran's hands, where he will either, as you said, have to double down and to say, the only way I'm going to achieve my objective is boots on the ground, and maybe Kharg's not even enough. Maybe you have to take out more, or he's going to have to basically adhere to what I perceive the Iranian demand to be, which is to restrain Bibi, right? I mean, I think Iran doesn't want to be Lebanon. They don't want to be hit every couple weeks, couple months as Iran, as Israel, the United States sees fit. And so that they're better off fighting a longer war now if that means restraining Israel in the future. And so that's, an awful place for both Israel and the United States to be. But, when Iran is willing to sacrifice as many lives and people as they have, then they can fight this war. So it's a very, I think, unstrategic at the end of the day for both the U.S. and Israel.
And yet again, it strikes me that an American administration has underestimated the complexities of the society that they've, gone to war against and have not done their homework. I mean, in Iraq, we had, Paul Bremer not really understanding the difference between Sunnis and Shias, or maybe Bush didn't understand it. And they made some terrible, terrible mistakes, stripping all the, Saddam Hussein's military of their salaries, of their status, of their dignity. And ISIS was born. This is a bit of a shortcut, but that's roughly what happened. And they're making mistakes again now, aren't they? So,
oh, absolutely. I mean, we have no idea. So we know. Okay, so best case scenario. I think the upper end of the estimates is 1 million, maybe 1.5 million people came out onto the streets in January. Right, that's very significant. These are people who want to see the regime falling. That's a lot. But at the same time, we've seen security forces that, depending on estimates, is 1.1 million, 1.2 million, and we've seen zero defections. So you have these two very large chunks of people, and you have 90 million people in the middle that we don't know anything about where they are. Our assumption is that many of them are anti-regime, but we don't really know. And so I think I wrote this, but I'll just say this quick story. What we had this interaction with the Iranian official one time in, I think 2022 or 2023, where we said, you have huge legitimacy problems. And this Iranian official acknowledges it. And he's like, you're right. He's like, we do. And he's like, but we have an equal number of people who are, committed to the regime and will die for the regime. And so he said, but he's like, but look, the vast majority just want a better life. And so we kind of started referring to this as like the 20-20-60 ratio. We made up the numbers, not him, and that they could be off. But the idea was that, that you have like this real split. And I think, it might not have worked, but from my perspective, the hope was this 60% of Iranians who want a better life would eventually join forces with the people who are opposed to the regime. And that might force a future leader to chart a different course for Iran's future. And a lot of that comes down to how they approach Israel, right? As long as you are, projecting hostility and existential threats to Israel, you're never going to have the economic relief you want. You're never going to have the security you want. So a lot of it just comes down to that pure thing. And so, there was the hope that and Khamenei was set in his course. He made his choice. He doubled down on ideology. But the hope was that whoever came next would have to actually really ask themselves the hard question, like, okay, like we've had 47 years of failure as an Islamic Republic. Like, we need to actually look at our foreign policy. We need to actually look at our domestic policy and see what we want to be. And the problem is we've kind of made the decision for them with this existential threat. We're saying, no, you have to double down on your current policy. You have to survive. Only force works. And so, maybe that's not a permanent decision, but at minimum, it delays any positive change for, I think, years at this point. And that's unfortunate.
So really what you're saying is that the administration, and Israel have done things in the last 3 weeks that have been completely counterproductive. We've gone from one Khamenei to another Khamenei. We've got a rump regime that is, surprisingly resilient. They're hanging on. And if they survive this, perhaps because of the chokehold that they have on the world economy, the one thing they're going to try and do is develop a nuclear weapon, because that's the only thing that might keep them as safe as, Kim Jong-un is being kept at the moment because of his nuclear weapon. So this is, they've done exactly the things that they set out not to do. Or rather, the result of what they've done is exactly the opposite to what they wanted.
Yeah, I hope you're wrong, but I think there's a very decent chance that's right? I mean, if you're an Iranian security official and you're like, what should we have done differently? I think, a lot of them are going to argue for pursuing a nuclear weapon. And they're going to say, hey, look, the U.S. has this perception that when we let any kind of people rise up or have any domestic opposition, that this is a chance for regime change. So like, we're not going to let any, personal freedoms. And so, this could happen.
But you could also get the opposite, right? I mean, if the regime falls, and the country ends up being a benign neighbor in this rather dangerous neighborhood, then Trump's gamble would have paid off. and you can
Yes.
finally get whatever prize he wants. I mean, that is still a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, look, if the bottom line goal should be an Iran that has a completely different foreign policy and treats its people differently. That is the goal. I think the problem with the war is we're not necessarily moving towards that. We're moving away. If the regime falls and a pro-Western, pro-Israeli Democrat comes in, great. This is like best case scenario. My worry is just we're not headed that direction, and in some ways we've delayed that.
When's this going to be over? Weeks or months from now? When's it going to be over?
Well, if we believe the report you referenced on the front end, right, it's another 4 weeks of Kharg before we even do Kharg. Then you have the Kharg operation. Then presumably you have a retaliation of that, and then to me that at that point, like you have to go all in at that point, or you have to back out. So I think in 6 weeks or so, we'll have to see this question revisited if this report is accurate, and then I would guess the president would not actually go for a full ground force invasion of Iran, but I can't say that confidently at this point. So I don't know. But my guess is, we'll have, another 4 or 5, 6 weeks, and then he'll have to actually look at this question again and say, okay, Iran has capitulated still. What now?
Nate, if Donald Trump, who loves to ring people directly out of the blue, rang you up tonight and said, I'm sorry, Nate, you shouldn't have been fired. You shouldn't have got lumed. You can come back on the team tomorrow morning. Would you?
At this point, no, I don't think I would go back in.
Are you sure?
But,
you could steer this whole thing in a
I
sensible way. You could have you could be part, a stakeholder as opposed to a ringside observer.
No, look, I mean, there is nothing I enjoy more than actually trying to help make Iran policy. I really do enjoy it, and it's been an honor to work on Iran policy in the U.S. government for 18 years. But I don't think I would have that role in the Trump administration. And now, after this war, I don't think meaningful diplomacy is going to happen in the next 3 years. So I think I'd rather take my chances in hopefully a future administration.
So do you think actually, when this fateful moment comes in 6 weeks or 2 months from now, the president should decide to go all in, send the troops, do a full-scale invasion?
I don't.
You don't?
I don't, no. No, I don't. I think it's one bad decision has been doubled down on every stage so far, right? Doing the operation was a mistake. Escalating the operation was a mistake. Potentially doing the cargo operation was a mistake. I don't understand how we can just continue to make the same decision over and over and think the outcome will be different. And so, unfortunately, he's left himself with only bad choices. But to me, that would probably be the worst outcome, or trying to foment this civil war. I mean, both those are awful outcomes. But so, no, I don't think he should do that.
Nate Swanson, Ronen Bergman, thank you very much to both of you from the bunker here in Jerusalem. And we'll speak to you again soon.